September 11, 1941. Arlington, Virginia. A chill mist clung to the early morning air as trucks rumbled over muddy roads, carrying steel beams and sacks of cement. You could almost taste the tension. The world was at war, and America's military leaders were desperate to consolidate power and command under one roof. At the edge of a muddy field along the Potomac River, a lone surveyor squinted through his transit scope, pencils clenched between his teeth, trying to sketch lines over the rolling topography that would soon become the Pentagon. Brigadier General Brehon Somervell, head of the Army Service Forces, paced along the edge of the clearing, clipboard in hand, issuing orders like a conductor directing an orchestra of chaos. Around him, workers shouted over the clatter of shovels and the hiss of steamrollers. Horses used to haul materials before trucks could arrive, stamped and snorted in the damp soil. It was a scene of controlled frenzy, the urgent ballet of men and machines racing against a war that threatened every day to spill over the Atlantic. The Pentagon was not just an ambitious building, it was a desperate solution. The Army's sprawling offices were scattered across dozens of temporary buildings in Washington, D.C., and the bureaucratic inefficiency threatened the nation's war effort. Somervell envisioned a colossal five-sided fortress of steel and concrete, designed to accommodate over 30,000 officers, clerks, and technicians under one roof. The challenge: build it in less than 2 years without slowing the ongoing mobilization for a global conflict. On that September morning, concrete trucks began rumbling over temporary wooden planks laid across the soggy fields. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison, appointed to oversee the design modifications, crouched over a blueprint taped to a makeshift table, eraser smudging the corners of meticulously drawn lines. "We need wider corridors here," he muttered, squinting at the plan. "And all stairwells must handle 2,000 men in evacuation. Minimum." His voice barely rose over the din, but every worker, engineer, and foreman knew this building wasn't just about efficiency, it was about survival, speed, and precision. Across the site, ironworkers threaded girders with gloved hands, the metal singing as sparks flew from welding torches. Cranes groaned under their own weight as massive steel beams hovered above the workers' heads, swaying like pendulums. For the men below, a single misstep could be fatal. And yet a sense of fierce pride carried them forward. They were building more than a structure. They were constructing a nerve center that would guide the American war machine, a fortress to withstand both the literal and figurative storms of global conflict. Local residents watched in awe and disbelief. Children pressed their faces against car windows, tracing the jagged silhouette of beams against a gray sky. The hum of activity was deafening. Concrete mixers groaning, rivets clanging, trucks honking. In the distance, but the rhythm was strangely organized, like a heartbeat for a city that hadn't yet been built. Every nail driven and beam set in place carried the weight of urgency, a reminder that the Axis powers were advancing overseas, while this massive five-sided vision began to rise from the Virginia soil, and while the Army's engineers faced deadlines that would crush ordinary mortals. They were fueled by innovation. Temporary rail lines were laid to shuttle steel from nearby mills directly to the site. Prefabricated concrete panels were cut and numbered for rapid assembly. Harrison and his design team implemented a modular plan that allowed 5 separate wedges to be constructed simultaneously, unprecedented for a building of this magnitude. By the time the sun set, the skeletal outline of the first wedge rose above the muddy expanse, a promise etched in steel and sweat. As dusk fell, General Somervell stood atop a small hill overlooking the site. Fog curled around the beams like smoke from distant battlefields. "This," he said quietly to himself, "is how we win the war here at home." Around him, the site hummed with a restless energy. Men were already planning the next day's maneuvers, pouring concrete, welding girders, hauling timber, all to a schedule that seemed impossible, yet somehow they believed it could be done. And in that foggy evening light, the first whisper of the Pentagon's vast shadow stretched across the Virginia fields, hinting at the colossal story that was only just beginning. October 7th, 1941. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and hot metal. Workers trudged through mud that clung to boots like glue as massive cranes swung steel beams into place. The first wedge of the Pentagon was beginning to take shape. its skeletal frame rising like a giant five-sided cathedral. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison adjusted his helmet, scanning the site with the intensity of a man who knew every delay could cost lives on distant battlefields. He pointed at a cluster of laborers. "Get those rivets in line. The concrete pours start at dawn." The construction schedule was brutal. Every day, the Army demanded progress equivalent to what would normally take 6 months. To meet it, engineers devised techniques that had never been attempted at this scale. Prefabricated concrete slabs, each weighing several tons, were transported along temporary rail lines and lifted into place by massive derricks. Workers with grease-streaked faces and soot-stained gloves positioned the panels with uncanny precision, their movements synchronized like dancers in a deadly ballet. In the corner of the site, Sergeant John Jack O'Malley, a former steelworker drafted into the Army Corps of Engineers, wiped sweat from his brow. He grinned at a younger recruit struggling with a cumbersome beam. "Keep it steady, kid," he barked. "One wrong move and we all end up in the Potomac." Around them, the din of rivets, hammers, and shouts created a chaotic symphony. Yet in the chaos, there was a rhythm, an understanding that every man, every bolt, every slab mattered. Inside the burgeoning structure, draftsmen and clerks worked alongside engineers to adjust plans in real time. Each change, each adjustment, rippled across the site, requiring foremen to coordinate deliveries, assign crews, and troubleshoot unforeseen obstacles. A miscalculation in weight distribution could delay an entire wedge, jeopardizing the timeline. Yet Harrison and his team refused to compromise. The Pentagon had to be ready, fully operational, and housing tens of thousands of personnel, all while the United States teetered on the brink of global conflict. Meanwhile, the press caught wind of the gargantuan project. Newspapers called it the Army's White Elephant, skeptical that such a massive structure could be built in the midst of wartime. But back on the muddy site, skepticism was irrelevant. Men labored through rainstorms that turned the ground into a quagmire, hauling steel and concrete by hand when machinery failed. The Army had imposed strict deadlines. The first wedge had to be finished before winter, or the schedule for the remaining 4 would collapse like dominoes. October bled into November, and by mid-month the first wedge had taken recognizable shape. Towering girders intersected with concrete slabs, forming the framework of hallways that would eventually stretch over 5 miles. The Army introduced night shifts to keep work moving, floodlights cutting through darkness as men continued their relentless march. In the eerie glow, riveters' sparks shot upward, illuminating mud-slicked faces and eyes reflecting both fatigue and determination. Even the smallest innovations mattered. Engineers developed an internal system of pneumatic tubes and temporary elevators to transport supplies across the vast site. Concrete mixers were stationed at strategic points to reduce travel time. Temporary wooden ramps allowed trucks to navigate treacherous terrain efficiently. Every innovation, every adjustment, was driven by the same urgent principle: speed. And yet beneath the urgency there was artistry, a calculated choreography that transformed disorder into a towering monument of human effort. By the end of November, progress was visible from the Washington skyline. Residents could see the wedge's frame rising like a jagged crown, a visual declaration that America was mobilizing with unprecedented scale and efficiency. General Somervell walked the site with Harrison, nodding at the growing structure. "We're on pace," Somervell said, voice low but firm. "But we can't stop. Every delay now costs lives overseas." And in that moment, the men and women of the Pentagon project understood. This wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, a nerve center, and a symbol of American industrial might, all erected in the shadow of a world at war. December 15, 1941. The sky was a dull, leaden gray over Arlington, and a cold wind whipped across the construction site, biting through wool coats and leather gloves alike. Snow threatened to fall any minute, and the Army's engineers knew that winter could slow or even halt progress if they weren't vigilant. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison walked briskly across the site, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, inspecting scaffolding and steel supports. Every girder, every bolt, every panel had to be exactly where it was planned, or disaster would follow. Inside the half-completed first wedge, workers labored tirelessly. Teams of riveters climbed precariously along the skeletal framework, sparks flying as metal met metal. Below, laborers shoveled frozen mud into wheelbarrows, hauling it to temporary drainage ditches. The site was a choreography of danger. One slip, one miscalculation, and the consequences could be fatal. Yet the men worked with a quiet pride. They weren't just building walls. They were constructing a symbol of resilience, a headquarters that would command the largest military force the world had ever seen. The sheer scale of the Pentagon presented unprecedented engineering challenges. Temporary supports were required for every massive concrete slab until it cured, and calculations had to account for weight distribution across 5 enormous wedges. Engineers experimented with early versions of modular construction, a technique rarely used at the time, allowing multiple sections to rise simultaneously without waiting for neighboring structures to finish. Harrison and his team worked around the clock to coordinate deliveries, ensuring that steel beams, cement, and prefabricated materials arrived just as crews were ready to install them. Amid the flurry of activity, Sergeant John O'Malley led a crew installing one of the building's first stairwells. Each step was hoisted into place with block and tackle pulleys, guided into exact alignment by steel templates. "Careful now," O'Malley barked, his voice muffled by a wool scarf. "We're not just building stairs. We're building escape routes for thousands." The young recruits nodded, muscles straining as they guided the heavy concrete steps into place. It was exhausting work, but morale remained surprisingly high. Songs and laughter echoed across the skeletal halls, competing with the thunderous clang of steel on steel. Outside, the Army experimented with construction innovations that would forever change the American building industry. Temporary railroad spurs delivered massive loads of materials directly to the site. Cranes of unprecedented capacity lifted panels into place with precision. And in a testament to wartime urgency, the Army even ordered thousands of trucks, bulldozers, and cranes diverted from other projects, concentrating them all on Arlington. Every resource was marshaled to a singular goal: finish the Pentagon before the demands of a world war outpaced the Army's ability to coordinate its forces. Even the smallest details required meticulous attention. Interior corridors had to be wide enough to accommodate thousands of moving men, clerks, and equipment at a time. Fireproofing had to meet standards that seemed almost impossible under the tight timeline, and the planners had to account for future expansion, air raid precautions, and communication lines that could survive both mechanical failure and enemy sabotage. Harrison pored over blueprints daily, revising calculations, and issuing orders with military precision. By January 1942, the Pentagon had transformed from a muddy field into a massive construction zone, humming with relentless activity. The first wedge was nearly complete, standing like a fortress of steel and concrete against the bitter winter winds. Workers paused only briefly to marvel at the view. Cranes silhouetted against a pale sky, rivets sparking like distant fireworks, and the skeletal outlines of the remaining wedges rising simultaneously in a mechanical rhythm. Every man on the site understood the enormity of their task. They were racing against both time and the tide of global conflict. And as night fell, floodlights illuminated the skeletal frame, casting long shadows that stretched across the frozen ground. In the glow, one could almost imagine the future bustle of tens of thousands of military personnel, papers rustling, phones ringing, and the Army coordinating operations on a scale never before attempted. The Pentagon wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of a nation at war, and the men and women shaping it were writing history one rivet at a time. February 2nd, 1942. A biting wind swept across the nearly complete first wedge of the Pentagon, carrying with it the sharp scent of wet concrete and burning coal from nearby furnaces. The construction site had become a small city of human energy. Over 15,000 workers now labored across the sprawling five-sided footprint. A blend of soldiers, civilians, engineers, and laborers all moving in tightly coordinated chaos. Every man had a role, every action was timed, and mistakes were not an option. The Army's eyes were fixed on one objective: finish the building in record time. Because the war would not wait. Colonel Leslie Groves, recently appointed to oversee wartime construction projects of unprecedented scale, strode through the muddy pathways. His sharp eyes scanned the site, noting bottlenecks in material delivery and adjusting priorities with the precision of a chess master. "We've got cranes idle in Sector C," he barked over the din of hammers and engines. "Shift those men and start the second pour immediately." Nearby foremen rushed to redirect truckloads of steel and timber, shouting orders in a mix of technical jargon and military authority. Inside the skeletal structure, Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison guided a team installing electrical conduits. Sparks flew as crews threaded miles of wiring through the concrete and steel framework. "Remember," Harrison reminded them, voice echoing against unfinished walls. "This building will be home to over 30,000 people. Every connection must hold." Men nodded, muscles straining as they hoisted heavy conduit pipes above their heads. The logistics alone were staggering. Not just wiring, plumbing or heating systems, but ventilation, fireproofing, and telephone lines that would eventually connect every office in the colossal building. Outside, new innovations kept the project moving at breakneck speed. Temporary railway spurs now extended to every wedge, shuttling steel beams, concrete panels, and equipment directly to the installation points. Giant derricks lifted panels weighing multiple tons, positioning them with an accuracy that would have been impossible in peacetime. Even adverse weather conditions, snow, freezing rain, and high winds were accounted for. Protective wooden scaffolding, tarpaulins, and makeshift heated shelters allowed crews to continue working when other construction projects would have shut down entirely. Meanwhile, morale and organization were carefully maintained. Sergeant John O'Malley patrolled the site, ensuring that men were rotating through shifts efficiently and safely. He barked encouragement at tired crews and barked warnings at anyone cutting corners. "The faster we go, the smarter we have to work," he shouted, and the crews obeyed. A shared sense of purpose fueled their relentless pace. Men who had never met before worked as if they had rehearsed for months, lifting slabs, welding beams, and pouring concrete in perfect synchrony. By mid-February, the second and third wedges were rising simultaneously. Concrete mixers ground continuously, pouring thousands of cubic yards into skeletal molds while ironworkers raced along steel frameworks, connecting beams that would soon support floors, ceilings, and offices. Temporary wooden ramps and scaffolding stretched across the site like a web, allowing men to move materials vertically and horizontally with astonishing efficiency. Harrison and his team constantly adjusted plans, moving crews, machinery, and supplies to meet the unforgiving schedule. Even as the Pentagon took shape, the larger war loomed in the background. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December had galvanized the nation, increasing the urgency of completing the building. Each day saved in construction translated directly into greater organizational efficiency for the Army's expanding operations. It was a race against both the calendar and the global conflict, and the Pentagon's builders understood that the eyes of history were upon them. By the end of February, the Pentagon's wedges had risen high enough to reveal the building's true scale. From a distance, the five-sided geometry was unmistakable, a marvel of both engineering and human determination. The floodlights at night illuminated the massive framework like a beacon, visible for miles. And as Harrison walked along the skeletal corridors, he imagined the offices, the bustling clerks, and the hum of military strategy that would one day fill the enormous halls. Every rivet, every panel, every bolt was part of a vision that was coming alive at a speed no one had thought possible. March 14, 1942. The wind off the Potomac River cut through layers of wool and leather, and the site of the Pentagon was a frozen battlefield of steel, concrete, and human determination. By now, nearly 20,000 workers had converged on Arlington, each man and woman a cog in a meticulously orchestrated machine. Yet the monumental pace of construction brought new challenges, structural, logistical, and human, that threatened to derail the carefully calculated timeline. A shipment of prefabricated concrete panels had arrived late from the mills in Pennsylvania. For hours, cranes and crews sat idle, staring at stacks of panels under a drizzle of freezing rain. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "We'll adjust the sequencing. Wedges D and E go on hold for now. Shift all manpower to finishing the stairwells and corridors in wedges A and B. Move." Men scrambled into action, moving hundreds of tons of materials with improvised wooden ramps and pulleys. Delays were unavoidable, but improvisation kept disaster at bay. Meanwhile, unforeseen engineering challenges tested the ingenuity of the Army's teams. The soil along the Potomac proved more treacherous than initial surveys suggested. Piles had to be driven deeper, and massive concrete footings were reinforced with steel rods to prevent shifting under the building's massive weight. Engineers worked in bitter cold, balancing calculations with hands stiffened from frostbite, their pencils scratching through snow-covered blueprints. Harrison personally supervised the reinforcements, measuring girder alignments against a template of the final design. One misalignment could cascade into a structural failure, and he knew it. Even the men themselves tested the limits of endurance. Long hours, freezing conditions, and grueling physical labor took their toll. On the second shift, Sergeant John O'Malley noticed fatigue setting in among his crews. "Take 5, he yelled, a rare command that drew groans but prevented accidents. They ate canned beans and coffee warmed over portable stoves, savoring every calorie. Despite exhaustion, the workers were bound together by an unspoken commitment. They were building a symbol of national resolve, a nerve center that would house tens of thousands of military personnel and coordinate the war effort. Flooding in low-lying areas added yet another complication. Heavy rains in early March turned parts of the site into impassable quagmires. Temporary drainage systems were hastily erected, workers wading through knee-deep water while maneuvering steel beams. Crane operators had to adjust lifts to avoid slick terrain, and concrete pours were timed to prevent panels from cracking in freezing conditions. The site was alive with tension, a constant balancing act between progress and safety. Yet adversity also sparked innovation. Engineers devised reinforced temporary walkways to maintain access to critical points. Panels were labeled with codes and coordinates, allowing multiple crews to install sections simultaneously without error. Riveters were given specialized harnesses to work safely along steel frameworks in high winds. Even the Army's delivery logistics were optimized. Trucks were scheduled to arrive in precise sequences to prevent traffic jams on the muddy pathways. Each day's obstacles became lessons for speed, safety, and precision. By the end of March, the Pentagon's 5 wedges had begun to interconnect. Corridors stretched from one section to another, the skeletal outline revealing a labyrinth of hallways that would eventually house offices, communication centers, and command posts. The first floors were poured, stairwells completed, and structural supports locked into place. From a distance, the building appeared unstoppable, a monolith of steel and concrete rising over Arlington. The Army, engineers, and laborers had faced impossible odds, and yet against mud, snow, shortages, and time itself, the Pentagon moved closer to completion with a relentless, astonishing rhythm. As the sun set behind the Potomac, flooding the skeletal framework with a soft golden light, General Somervell and Harrison walked the site, surveying the progress. "Never thought we'd see anything like this," Somervell murmured. Harrison nodded, his face grim but proud. "It's not just a building," he replied. "It's a statement that we can organize, innovate, and build even when the world is on fire." And in the gathering shadows of the vast structure, the Pentagon's future hum of activity seemed almost audible, a mechanical heartbeat, growing louder with each passing day. July 15, 1942. The Virginia sun beat down mercilessly on the construction site, turning mud into dry, crackling dust and steel beams into ovens of molten heat. Yet the pace never faltered. Tens of thousands of men moved like a single organism across the sprawling footprint of the Pentagon, now unmistakable in its 5-sided grandeur. The skeletal frames of all wedges were nearly complete, and the final stages, roofing, interior walls, and finishing, had begun. Every day brought the building closer to housing over 30,000 military personnel, a centralized command for a nation fully at war. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison strode through one of the nearly finished corridors, his boots echoing off unfinished concrete floors. Electricians threaded thousands of wires, plumbers fitted pipes, and carpenters installed doors and frames with precision. "Check those alignments," Harrison barked. "Every office, every stairwell, every corridor must be ready for occupancy." Men nodded, sweating beneath helmets, sleeves rolled up and faces streaked with grime. Outside, cranes lifted roof panels into place while riveters continued welding beams at dizzying heights. The construction effort had become a symbol of wartime efficiency. Supplies were transported along temporary rail spurs and narrow roads engineered specifically for the project. Prefabricated panels were numbered and coded to allow crews to install sections without error, and massive concrete mixers churned night and day. Each wedge had its own workforce, yet the five-sided design required constant coordination. Crews had to synchronize movements to connect the corridors and ensure structural integrity. Even with meticulous planning, danger was never far. On July 18th, a heavy gust of wind sent a steel beam swinging dangerously near a group of workers. Sergeant John O'Malley barked orders, guiding the beam into place and preventing disaster. The near miss reminded everyone that the Pentagon's construction was not just an engineering challenge, but a test of courage, precision, and teamwork. Every rivet, every slab, every bolt had been installed under conditions that would have crushed ordinary projects. By late July, the Pentagon was more than a building. It was a monument to American resolve. Hallways stretched for miles, offices awaited desks and telephones, and mechanical systems hummed with the promise of operational efficiency. From above, the five wedges formed a perfect pentagon, each edge radiating out like a giant command star. The Army's vision, once a distant sketch on Harrison's drafting table, had become reality. On August 15, 1942, exactly 16 months after groundbreaking, the last beam was set in place. Workers cheered, and the deafening roar of cranes and hammers fell silent for the first time. General Brehon Somervell and Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Harrison stood atop the fifth wedge, surveying the completed structure. "It's done," Somervell said, his voice heavy with awe. "Against time, against war, against every obstacle." Harrison nodded, the enormity of the achievement settling over him. "And it will house the minds that win this war," he replied. Inside, the Pentagon was ready to function as the largest office building in the world. Over 30,000 military personnel would soon fill its corridors, managing logistics, communications, and strategy on a scale never before attempted. Every challenge, logistical bottlenecks, weather delays, material shortages, and engineering puzzles, had been overcome through ingenuity, discipline, and relentless human effort. The building itself had become a symbol that a nation united in purpose could achieve the impossible, even while the world burned around it. As the sun set on the newly completed Pentagon, floodlights bathed its five-sided frame in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the Virginia landscape. The air was heavy with the smell of fresh concrete, metal, and triumph. And for the thousands who had poured sweat, skill, and courage into the construction, there was a quiet, shared pride. America had built the world's largest office building in just 16 months, under the shadow of global war. And in doing so, it had crafted both a fortress and a testament to national resolve. The Pentagon stood ready, a humming nerve center at the heart of the American war effort, prepared to guide a nation through the storms of World War II and beyond. Thanks for watching.